Ladies and gentlemen, in this RedGamersHead.com video, we're going to be further discussing indie developers and their opinions on the retail market space and various other bits and pieces. This has been conducted in a couple of interviews, and there is some rather interesting uses of verbiage in these interviews, so I'm probably going to have to censor some of it for those of you who mind strong language. Let's go with... Anyway, there are a number of indie developers all on stage. And these include the guys behind Prison Architect, Dreamfall, Frozen Synapse, Rock Paper Shotgun, and so forth. Anyway, this whole thing began by Mark Morris, to be precise, started the whole thing by saying publishers and retailers are C's, and let's just say that. He then started to go forward and said, from our perspective, we couldn't get our games anywhere near the UK retail when we started out. There was no interest in picking up any obscure titles, they just wanted 100 copies of the latest AAA title. If that model had continued, the indie revolution could not have occurred. Prison Architect is the most financially successful project that Introversion has ever done, without a shadow of a doubt. End quote for just a second. It's worth pointing out that Prison Architect is using a paid alpha model style to basically help fund the project. So the discussion itself continued as Project Eternity developer Chris Avellone was also talking, and he was talking about publisher and traditional retailer risk. And now this is something I've been talking about quite extensively myself, and this basic concept. The problem is, when you have a game, you want to know that you're going to make cash from that game, because ultimately if you're sinking a certain amount of money into that title, you want to make sure that it sells well, because, well, if it doesn't, you are quite literally out of pocket. Anyway, he said, to play devil's advocate here, to the extent I understand where publishers are coming from, when you're investing 20 to 30 million in a crazy AAA game, the desire to take risks and be innovative, the desire to experiment with a hardcore PC-only game, they don't want to hear any of that. They know their investment is so large and understand the levels of return they need to get, but the more we can get out of the loop of the old business model, the better. End quote for just a moment. Meanwhile, Mark Morris's introvert colleague, his name is Chris Delay, also weighed in a little bit more on the alpha game model, and he said one of the wonderful aspects of the alpha is we get feedback. Sometimes it can take as long as 2 years before anyone saw it, as your funds slowly start to trickle down to zero while you're making it. So the purpose behind this, obviously, end quote, the purpose behind this is that the developers themselves know exactly what revenue they are making during the alpha process. For example, let's say you are doing a project. You don't know really how well that project is going to do. You can guess, you can do market analysis, you can, X, Y, and Z, but unless you've got a history of that project, say for example a new Call of Duty, unless you've got a history of that and you know that, okay, we are going to make X, whatever X is, then you're basically just guessing in the dark and hoping it done well. For example, did the guys behind, say, Terraria or Amnesia or Minecraft or any of those indie titles know exactly how successful they were going to be? Most likely not. They had a feeling that yes, they're probably onto a winner. They thought to themselves they might be able to make themselves, rent money or something, just for example, but they probably didn't realize how much of a major success it would be. The point behind this whole model is that if you have a second source of revenue, obviously you need something to initially set up the development of the project. There's no getting away from that, unless you're going to go the Kickstarter route, which we'll talk about in a moment. However, the idea behind the alpha is simple. You basically look at whatever cash that your players are putting in, and it's also better because they're also acting as, well, basically playtesters. So in other words, let's say that they find a bug. Let's say at one point in the world that you fall through it and it blue screens, just for example. Well, then they can say, okay, in this area X happens, and they can either fill out a ticket, or they can email you, or they can post it on the forum, whatever. Now, this is much better than the traditional way, because obviously, traditionally, you would have to, well, pay playtesters to do this. In other words, you would have to pay a group of people or get your friends to do it, or whatever, depending on what your resources and have access to basically play that section of the game and say, hey, do you find any issues? And the problem is with playtesting, you're still going to miss something. Playtesting, this is why Blizzard still do, well, the servers. This is why you can go on the PTR, for example, that they invite players in when, of course, they're making a new expansion. They invite players inside and they say, okay, we want you guys to test this out because obviously we can't cover everything. Now, obviously, even a small player base, let's say, for example, they invite 10,000 people, they're still not going to be able to find as much stuff as, say, several million people. That's just a given. However, it's free, right? So it's pretty awesome. Now, this paid alpha model is definitely going to become a lot more prevalent, I would say, in the gaming circles or development circles. And as I've spoken about before, then you've got other ways of funding the project. Now, traditionally, we know ways you can do it would be something like, well, all of your friends club together money to fund whatever they need, say software licenses or whatever. Or maybe if you've got your own skill set, maybe you can create your own engine or whatever. And there are various other ways of doing that as well. Maybe you could even get a small amount of cash, just for example, if you've happened to produce a really cool mod. And sometimes, of course, people actually get employed based upon the strength of the mod they've created. For example, a couple of guys have actually got snapped up by Valve for doing that with Half-Life 2. However, the reality of the matter is, let's say that you don't have all the skills required to produce a game. For example, let's say you're a programmer, and let's say you're good at designing, and let's say you could do X, and maybe you could even do some web design and stuff, but the reality of the matter is you also need someone to produce, say, the art for the game. You also need someone to, for example, do some fault testing to create the music, animate it, and so on and so on and so on. The reality of the matter is there's just no one with that amount of skill really out there, because it's just impossible to do everything on your own project unless it's a fairly small game. Then of course you can, but I mean, obviously there have been examples of someone who can, or someone has done something like that, but the reality of the matter is when it starts to become more complicated, it's not really that simple, and most of the time this is done by teams. So it's most likely now that we're going to be seeing an insurgence of things such as Kickstarter, because the reality is the amount you need to start is a lot smaller, and several people in the community have already expressed their disdain for, say, Microsoft and how they handle indie developers, right? And that's one of the reasons that, ironically enough, even Nintendo are being seen as a bit of a safe haven for indie developers, because Nintendo are extending their hand out. Well, let's face it, Nintendo need pretty much any software they can get right now. And PC development, of course, is pretty darn easy. So, no doubt, indie developers are going to want to show off their stuff, and to be honest with you, one of the reasons that Steam flourishes, and of course GOG along with other sites, is because of their support for indie developers. And of course, even things such as Humble Bundle are good ways to get lots of cash really, really quickly. As for the indie space, I have seen the odd example, in the UK at least, of, say, Xbox Live Points having, say, a Minecraft figure on them and say, buy Minecraft with these amount of points or whatever. Because obviously, it doesn't take a genius to know that Minecraft is going to sell well, and therefore those points are going to sell well. But reality of the matter is, indie games in retail stores aren't really that much of a big deal now. And when you think about it from an indie perspective, for consoles it doesn't really make sense, because obviously you've got PlayStation Network, and you've got Xbox Live, and you've got Steam, and whatever else. And well, PC Marketplace, the retail, even for titles like Call of Duty, is starting to die now. It's as simple as that. There's just not really a major call to actually have discs, because you can get them so bloody cheap digitally. It's a case of just a CD key now, which of course there are dozens of different sites to get those. So, as you said, most retailers, most publishers are not willing to take the risks. But I think it's good because the indie scene is, in my opinion, one of the most exciting in video games right now. Obviously, there are the big titles. Obviously, there are the Batman, Arkham games. Of course, you've got titles like Mirror Edge coming out. You've got the new Killzone. But without the smaller games as well, you would lose a hell of a lot of innovation and a lot of creative talent in the industry. Imagine, for example, what would actually have happened if Minecraft had never been produced. It would have, without a doubt, changed the way that gaming has been seen. Anyway, so this is a fairly small analysis, but I've covered this quite extensively recently, so I just thought I'd put it out regardless, because I thought it's quite interesting opinions there. As I said, fairly strong language, so I've had to mute some of it, because obviously I don't really know the age you are. If you're like 30, obviously, then that's one thing, but for all I know, you maybe not, or maybe you get offended by bad language or whatever. Anyway, so hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I will see you soon. Take care, and bye for now.